Well, good evening, everybody. We're back. Bible study is back. It's already been mentioned, but I'm going to mention it again so that we're all on the same page and with a microphone to be able to hear better. If there's questions, comments, interaction, please feel free, as we always have in the past. But because our distance from each other is more widespread, please speak as loud as possible. And if there's a problem, like Suzette, don't refrain from speaking just because you can't raise your voice. I will repeat the question or the comment for everybody if need. But I don't want to do that for every comment, though, okay? Just so that it makes things easier. So without concern, I'll just repeat what you say, okay? And then it won't be a need for you to try to project and strain your voice. You're very welcome. So don't let that be an inhibition or prohibition to speak if you want to say something. Well, here we are. Let's open with prayer. And is there somebody who's just itching to open in prayer? You've been waiting for this moment? Amen. Well, here we are heading once again into Hebrews chapter 11. And we're looking at 32 to 34, and after 4 months, someone else will be able to read instead of me. So what we'll do is perhaps start here, we'll go along this way, and we'll zigzag, all right? So, Jeanne, can we start with you? Hebrews 11, 32 to 34, please. And good, as loud as you're comfortable doing so. Yes, please. That's good right there. That's good. Thank you. Yep. No worry at all. We wouldn't have been hurting if you'd have gone further, but just for the sake of time, we'll leave it at that. So we've looked at these other individuals that have been mentioned here in verse 32, except now for Samuel. So we're coming to him tonight, and likely we won't get everything dealt with on him this evening. I expect that there's a bulk for him, so I expect possibly we'll be dealing with him again next week. So looking at Samuel, the various things that they did through faith, they subdued kingdoms, they obtained promises, they worked justice or righteousness. So dependent upon your translation would indicate which one that's going to be. They worked justice or righteousness. And that's an aspect that we're looking at with Samuel, where he administered justice. He administered righteousness on behalf of the nation. He also obtained promises, and he, in a sense, subdued kingdoms, as we're going to look at later tonight or next week when we get to that point. The thing that we need to keep in mind is that out of weakness, they were made strong, or from weakness, they received strength. And that strength was from God. And every time we look at an individual or a group of people that trusted God throughout the Scriptures or even today, we need to keep in mind Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2. And I think I've reiterated or touched on it at least once through each of our times looking here at the book of Hebrews in chapter 11. And of course, that is that we would put our eyes, fix our eyes, look at Jesus, who is the author, the one who begins our faith, and the one who completes it, the one who perfects our faith. He's the foundation. Even when Jesus is not already come in human form, as of Matthew chapter 1 or Luke chapter 2, or even Mark's Gospel chapter 1, Mark already has him beginning his ministry at his baptism, and John, of course, in the beginning was the Word. But he has him in chapter 1 and verse 14, now tabernacling with us. So that's John's incarnation story. But even before Jesus came, born of a woman, Jesus was intimately and intricately involved in the affairs of mankind and throughout history. So that in each person's life, the faith that they exercised was always, the foundation was Jesus, always and every single time. And it was looking forward to what was going to be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we look back at what was fulfilled. So no matter what side of the cross individuals were or are on, if it's before the cross, it's looking forward to the cross. If it's since the cross, we're looking back to the cross or from the cross. Okay? With that back in our minds or fresh in our minds, I want to go back to 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel 1, and we're going to look at verse 20. First Samuel 1 and verse 20.
So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked the Lord for him and presented him before the Lord, and he will live there always.
All right, so we've got this young child, and he's given a name, and his name is Samuel. So here it is in Hebrew. Shmuel. And the name Shmuel, anybody know what the name Shmuel means? Pardon me? God has heard. God has heard, or heard of God, or heard by God. When we look at his name, here's the part that refers to God, the El, and then the first part, the Shema. Does that sound familiar? Shema. What does that remind you of? What does that bring to your mind? Shema. I'll say it again. Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. For your information, when that is recited, Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Do you recognize the name Adonai? Okay, so it's in there twice. And then Eloheinu is yet another name for God. But the Adonai is actually the word Lord. When you have all upper capitals, capital L, and then a lower font, capital O, capital R, and capital D. It's Shema Yisrael Yehovah Eloheinu Yehovah Echad. But the Jews say Adonai because they will not pronounce the covenant or sovereign name of God for fear that they may take it in vain. So when you hear Adonai in the Shema, they substitute, it's still a name of God, but it's not the covenant name of God that was given to Moses. Anyway, that's just something thrown in there, so that you're aware of that, so that we are keeping track with what it literally is, what we're looking at. Okay, so heard of God. That's what Samuel or Shmuel's name means. Hannah has been barren. And the interesting thing is that when you look at her story, she's one of two wives of Elkanah in chapter 1 and verse 1. So Samuel's father's name is Elkanah. His mother's name is Hannah. But he has another wife, and her name is Peninnah or Peninnah. Now, if you have a look at verse 3, verse 2, and I want to look also at verse 4. Chapter 1, verse 2, and verse 4. So we're at Johnny. Peninnah, that's a hard name. And verse 4.
Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife
Peninnah. All right. So it's not just that Peninnah had a son or a child or two, but she had many sons and many daughters. You can just feel the heartache of Hannah, where she has no child and she's been calling out to the Lord, Lord, please open my womb, please open my womb, please open my womb. But over and over again, when we see somebody throughout history in the Old Testament scriptures, when they were barren, more often than not, when it's in the story of God, and then she ends up having a child, it's because the barrenness was God had used because the Lord had closed her womb. And for His glory, He then opens that womb. And that's what happens in this instance here, so that it can be seen. Who's the most famous person in the Old Testament that had a womb that was closed, she was barren, and finally she had a child? Most famous, most well-known. What is it? Was it Rachel? I'm asking you. Okay, so Rachel is one. Sarah. Abraham and Sarah. Yeah. So Rachel, she was barren. Yes. Rebecca, she was barren. Yes. We've got Hannah, who was barren. And throughout these examples, we see that it's to show that it wasn't a matter that finally, after enough tries, they conceived. But this is an indication and a demonstration to us that God works through weakness to bring about His glory and to show His strength. Do you remember we saw in Hebrews 11 that out of weakness they were made strong? It's not just Samuel who was made strong out of his weakness, or Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, and so on. But it was also those who were connected to them. Samson's mother was barren, and then the angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You will have a son, and he will be the judge of Israel." And of course, Samson was conceived. What does Samuel have in common with Samson? Set apart. They both had long hair. Yes. They were Nazarites from birth. Exactly. So that's Samuel's mom said that, right. And the angel of the Lord spoke to Manoah's wife, because we don't know the name of Samson's mother, but told her that he will be a Nazarite from birth. And they two, the two of them, had that in common with what other prophet? What did those two, Samson and Samuel, they had that in common? What other prophet had that in common with them? John the Baptist, yes. John the Baptist. So looking at these, there's this picture here of hearing. Hearing. And Hannah's praying, Lord, please open my womb. And we're not going to look at the particulars of that just yet. I want us to see that God hears her when she prays. So that's where the name Shmuel comes from, heard of God. The Lord heard me. And I think that his very namesake shaped Samuel, Shmuel, for his life ahead. Think about his name, and what do we see early on in his story? Not before his birth, but after he was born and brought to the tabernacle in Shiloh. What do we see that is very close? It's the feature point, if you will, of his early story that's connected to his name, Shmuel. Suzette is shaking her head like she knows. Do you want to? The Lord spoke to him. Yeah, the Lord talked to him. And what did Eli say to him when he realized it was the Lord calling to him? He said, he instructed him to respond how? Speak, Lord, for your servant Shmaz. Your servant is listening. Shema. So the one who is there because the Lord heard his mother's cry is now saying, now God, I want to hear you. I'm going to listen. And it's not just I want to listen. I want to obey. Whatever you say, I will do. And that characterizes Shmuel's life. Right through his early life when we're introduced to him, right on up until his death. I want to come back to verse 1, still in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And I just want to look at a couple of points here. So in verse 1, we see it again in verse 19. There's a place that they are from. All right, so Deb, are you comfortable with the names that are there? Verse 1, or chapter 1 and verse 1?
There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite.
There's a lot going on there, isn't there? All right, so we've got this picture now that he is from, and that makes Samuel from the same place, from Ramathaim Zophim, from the region of Ephraim. And at the very end of verse 1, it says that he is a what? Somethingite, Ephraimite. So that means that he would be from the tribe of, at first glance. But was he an Ephraimite? No. Let's go ahead, and I want to look at 1 Chronicles chapter 6. 1 Chronicles 6. There's a few verses that I want to see here, but I don't know if we'll read them all. So let's make it... I think what I'll do is we'll start in verse 31, and then we're going down to verse 38, but I'll say in a couple of spots, let's skip, because it's a bunch of names. In the interest of simplicity, I was just Deb's suggestion is a good suggestion. I'll take it, all right, so that we're not, it's not confusion. All right, so verse 31 of 1 Chronicles chapter 6. Now, these are the men whom David appointed over the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark came to rest. Do you remember last week in the study we were looking at the Ark of the Covenant that had made its journey from in 1 Samuel chapter 4, and the Hophni and Phinehas took the Ark of the Covenant into battle against the Philistines. Actually, what we'll do, I'll bring it up. Here we go. And for those that may be watching this online, the slides that we put up, the PowerPoint that we put up, you can find it on our website, evangelheartland.com, under audio messages for this particular week, and it'll be there in PowerPoint or PDF. So you'll find it there for your use, okay? So you see that the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle was in Shiloh, and then the Philistines engaged the Israelites in battle here in Aphek. And they thought it would be a good idea to take the Ark of the Covenant into the battlefield, but they were treating it more as a superstitious thing, like a lucky rabbit's foot. Like a horseshoe. We don't deal with rabbit's feet unless they're attached to a live rabbit. For those of you who don't know, we had a pet rabbit for years, so that's a personal thing. All right, so the Ark of the Covenant then was there, and then for about 100 years, so close to 100 years, the Ark of the Covenant had been away from the tabernacle, which was now in Nob, right here, Nob. Not far from Jerusalem. When David finally becomes king, here in Chronicles, we see that David brings the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Yearim to Jerusalem after a 3-month stint because they were interrupted because of Uzzah had reached out and touched it. Then it was at the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months, and then they brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Once that takes place, David sets up several courses of singers who are priests, who are Levites. And that's where we are here in 1 Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 31. Now, these are the men whom David appointed over the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark came to rest. They were ministering with music before the dwelling place of the tabernacle of meeting until Solomon had built the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. So the house of the Lord is the temple. And they served in their office according to their order. So these are the ones who ministered with their sons. Of the sons of the Kohathites. All right, so keep that in mind. The Kohathites. They were, and then there's a number of names that are here. Heman the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Shmuel, Samuel, the son of Elkanah, the son of Joram, the son of Eliel, the son of Toah. And then it continues on further with more names that are indicated there. Then down in verse 38, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, the son of Israel. So these are those who are descendants of Levi, which makes them Levites. Particularly, they are from one of Levi's 3 sons, Kohath, and they are Kohathites. So Samuel was a Levite. That Elkanah was referred to as an Ephraimite was because Ephraim was the predominant tribe in that middle northern area of Israel. So being the dominant tribe and living in that region would have been referred to as an Ephraimite instead of a Judahite, for instance. Furthermore, it could have been that one of his parents, Elkanah's parents, may have been from the tribe of Ephraim and married with a Levite, thereby giving him that designation as well. But we need to see that Samuel indeed was a Levite. That's what qualified him in order to minister at the tabernacle. How could he do so unless he was a Levite? Furthermore, we see throughout his ministry that he offers sacrifices. And he wears a linen ephod, which is the priestly garment.
Question. With the Levites, I just always had this impression that they never had a land. I had the impression that they served the Lord and they served the other tribes of Israel.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that they would have dispersed before they would have, like once a year they would have to come together and serve in the temple. But I'm assuming that they would have dispersed and lived amongst the different tribes.
Mm-hmm. You assume correctly, yes. So looking at Joshua chapter 21, do you want to go there for a second? Joshua chapter 21. So the Israelites are now in the land of Canaan, which will have its name changed to Israel, because that's who's dwelling there. And in chapter 21, let's look at verse 1. Then the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites came to Eleazar the priest, to Joshua the son of Nun, and to the heads of the fathers' houses of the tribes of the children of Israel. And they spoke to them at Shiloh, so that's where the tabernacle is as of Joshua chapter 18. It was located in Shiloh 7 years after they entered into the promised land. Okay? And they said, the Lord commanded through Moses to give us cities to dwell in with their common lands for our livestock. So the children of Israel gave to the Levites from their inheritance, at the commandment of the Lord, these cities and their common lands. Now pay attention, look at this in verse 4. Now the lot came out for the families of the Kohathites. And the children of Aaron the priest, who were of the Levites, had 13 cities by lot, from the tribe of Judah, from the tribe of Simeon, from the tribe of Benjamin, and the rest of the children of Kohath had 10 cities by lot from the families of the tribe of Ephraim, from the tribe of Dan, and from the half-tribe of Manasseh. And then it continues on, talks about Gershom and then Merari. Those are the other two sons of Levi. He had 3 sons. So Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. And so each of those clans had different responsibilities with the service in the tabernacle and then later the temple. But initially with the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was in existence and service for how many years? Any idea? Ballpark. All right, how about how much? 450 years. About 450 years. Yeah. Good job. Yep, exactly, yeah. Baseball and, you know. So for that period of time, this is what the responsibility was of the 3 clans of the Levites. And remember, the Kohathites had a responsibility. Let's go to Numbers chapter 3. Just so you get a picture of what kind of stock, lineage, Samuel is coming from and what qualifies him for the service which he performs, the ministry that he's a part of. So Numbers chapter 3, let's look at verses 28 to 32. Claire, are you okay with reading that? Numbers 3, 28 to 32. We won't need to worry about the name there specifically, so just jump down to verse 31.
And their charge shall be the ark, and the table, and the candlestick, and the altars, and the vessels of the sanctuary wherewith they ministered, and the hanging, and all the service thereof.
And I think we'll leave it there because it just gives a little more detail in verse 32 as to who was specifically in charge of their service. So notice, what were the Kohathites responsible for? The most holy things in the tabernacle. All right, so let's go ahead to chapter 7, still Numbers, chapter 7. Have a look at verse 2 to 9. There might be a couple of jumps here, I'm not sure, but Craig, would you? 7 verses 2 to 9. All right, so notice the distinction there. The very important piece of information is that the Kohathites carried the most holy articles. They weren't given any wagons or carts as that we would probably more associate with that idea of transporting specifically or especially the Ark of the Covenant. Because that's where David went wrong. Do you remember? David, what did he do? He put the Ark of the Covenant on a new cart, or the ESV would probably call it a new wagon. And the reason they did that is probably because of what the Philistines did when they captured it and sent it back to Israel. They put it on a new cart. But they were ignorant of the commands of the Lord. The Israelites were not. And that's what David said. The reason that God struck out against us in his holy anger was because we did not consult the Scriptures to see what we were supposed to do. And it's because you priests did not carry the ark. And then that's why this occurred. So now you must carry it. And then they took 6 steps. And what do? And then they celebrated, right? They offered sacrifices and then celebrations, and then they continued on with their trek.
Whose farm when the Philistines put the ark on the cart in the first place, whose land did it end up in?
It came into common land in Beth Shemesh, in the Sorek Valley.
So it just stayed there for years?
No, so you can find that in 1 Samuel chapter 5. 6 maybe. So the question was, where did the Ark of the Covenant arrive when it finally came? So this is in chapter 6, 1 Samuel 6. And then it was carried by 2 cows that had just calved. And in verse 13, verse 12, the lords of the Philistines went after them to the border of Bet Shemesh. And the people of Bet Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. They lifted up their eyes and saw the ark and rejoiced to see it. Actually, you know what it did? It came to the field of Joshua of Bet Shemesh and stood there. A large stone was there, and so they split the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. So it was Joshua's field. Levites were involved, and then they looked inside the Ark of the Covenant. They took the cover off, and it's interesting, the Ark of the Covenant came to where? Whose field? Joshua's, which means the Lord saves, which is the same name of our Savior, Yeshua. All right, so the Lord saves, and it's like with Yeshua coming to his field, it's like saying, all right, this is even a foreshadowing of the Yeshua that will come to bring salvation and bring the very presence of God among you. So the Lord struck them dead when they looked inside. Why did he strike them dead? Was he facetious? Let's look at it this way. In order to look inside, what did they have to do? They had to remove the cover. And by removing the cover, what were they taking away? What was on the cover? What is it? The blood. And over here, the mercy seat. So the cover was called the mercy seat, and the mercy seat was covered in blood. Some 450 years worth of blood. Only once a year, the high priest went into the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was, and then he offered sacrifice outside of the tabernacle, went in with the blood of a bull for himself, and sprinkled it upon the Ark of the Covenant 7 times, then went back out and sacrificed a goat on behalf of the nation, went back in with the blood of the goat and sprinkled 7 times on the Ark of the Covenant. So 14 sprinkles this year, the first year. Then the next year, the same thing, splashing with blood. And for 450 years, this had been taking place. But whether it was one time it was sprinkled or it had been done 450 times now, nevertheless, it was blood. And it was blood that turned that seat into a mercy seat. Because without the blood, the mercy seat is not a mercy seat, but it's a seat of judgment. So they removed that which was the mercy seat, the blood, to look inside, and what was inside? The tablets of the law, along with a jar of manna and Aaron's staff that budded. But primarily it was the tablets of the law, and Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that the law is a ministry unto death, but the Spirit is a ministry unto life. So that's what ended up taking place there. And then they called for the Levites in Kiriath Yearim. So it was in Bet Shemesh. And then they called for the Levites in Kiriath Yearim to come and take it. And then they brought it to their city. So Kiriath Yearim was a Levitical city. And that's where it stayed until David made the attempt to bring it to Jerusalem. That first attempt failed because they went with the way that the world, the standard of the world had set up. Let's send it up on a new cart. And so it stayed there for 3 months, and then David was successful in bringing it to Jerusalem. So that brings us sort of full circle with the Kohathites yet again. They were the ones that carried the Ark of the Covenant for David into Jerusalem and its new resting place until Solomon built the temple. The oxen stumbled, yeah. So Uzzah put his hand out to stabilize the ark. He was struck dead. Yeah. And I think it was more than just that he touched the ark. I think there's a picture there to show us that God does not need anyone's help to remain stable. Now, the ark was not God, but the ark represented the presence of God. So he's saying, I don't need any man's help. To Jesus. Yes, it was foreshadowing Christ. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's come back to 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 1. And we see that they live in Ramah. So this is also down in verse 19. So they got up early in the morning. This was the end of that time there. And they returned and came to their house at Ramah. And it was during that time then, once they returned home, that Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and she conceived because the Lord remembered her, because she called out, the Lord heard her cry. Now, this place Ramah, it's also spoken about in chapter 2 and verse 11. And this is where Samuel, in the end, will be buried. This is his resting place. Now, in Ramah, it's also known as Ha-Ramatha. Ha-Ramatha. So this is Ramah. So to give you perspective, this is Jerusalem. This is Ramah. So when they were coming to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was to begin with, they would come from Ramah up to Shiloh. So that's the region that gives you a bit of perspective of what they were doing. But Ramah, also known as Ha-Ramatha, is the place that you and I would recognize from Matthew chapter 27 and verse 57 in association with Jesus' death and burial. There's a guy who's involved who is from Ha-Ramatha or Ha-Ramathea. What does that sound like? Ha-Ramathea. There's a guy along with Nicodemus. What is it? Arimathea. The Greek term for this is Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph was also from Ramah. You see some connection there with the involvement. It's not just the person, the people, but it's also at times the places in which they are associated or they live that connects some things with the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. So Joseph of Arimathea was a righteous man and God-fearer, and what had been a secret disciple of Christ, but he became a very obvious follower of Christ when he refused to cast his vote with the Sanhedrin against Jesus to condemn him to death. And he stood up and said, Pilate, may I lay claim of his body to bury him in my tomb. A newly cut tomb in which nobody has been laid. So that means there was no defilement in that tomb. I like Chuck Missler. He's a Bible teacher, and he speaks about that in a Jewish sense, and he says you picture in the sense of a Jew when Pilate would say to Joseph, you're going to give your tomb to a man you don't even know, to a common criminal? And he would say, oy vey, for 3 days only it is. Anyway, let's keep moving on. So looking at Samuel's life, as it is, he's conceived in this idea of God responding to his mother's prayer. So prayer sets the stage for Samuel and his ministry and his life. We see some similarities, some parallels between Samuel, his life, and the life of Jesus in some of these respects. So let's have a look at one thing to begin with. This isn't specifically as it parallels Jesus, but as we see a detail about Samuel, that Josiah, anybody remember King Josiah? Do you recognize the name King Josiah, the boy king? Became a king at 8 and so on, but he feared God. Let's go to 2 Chronicles. Leave a marker in 1 Samuel because we're coming back there. But let's go to 2 Chronicles 35. By the way, I'm going to say it again. I'm so glad that we're together again. It's a joy. To be able to teach with live people that I know and love, no less. So I just want to express my thankfulness for that. So 2 Chronicles 35 and verse 18. Are you okay reading that, Suzette? All right, back to Jeanne, please. 2 Chronicles 35, verse 18. All right, so notice the big thing that is told us here about Samuel. We don't find out this detail in the book of Samuel. We find this detail several hundred years later. Like this is 400 years later. This is 500 years later. After Samuel, Josiah is now the king. And so it's 500 years after Samuel, and we're told that Passover had not been observed like this since the days of the prophet Samuel. So we're told a couple of details there. One, that Samuel was a prophet, and two, that Samuel did what? He made a really big deal of the Passover. Not just that he observed the Passover, but that Samuel made a really big deal about observing the Passover. There's something important regarding that because for 350 years, the people of Israel, they were led by judges, but that was only periodically. The land was not always under the rulership of a judge. There would be times that after the judge died, then the people, they would revert back to their sinful lives, and then God would again raise up another judge. But what's one of the key things that we're told about the days of the judges? Everyone did what? What was right in their own eyes. And so there's indication there that although they might have observed Passover to some degree or another, or maybe not, that when Samuel became the judge, because Samuel was a priest, we saw, he's a Levite. We now know that he's a prophet, and we will not just hear that from the writer of the Chronicles, but we find out in 1 Samuel chapter 3 that all the people from the time that Samuel heard from God, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," and then he gives that word to Eli, and then we're told, and all the people of the land of Israel knew that Samuel was a prophet. So we know those two things, and he's also a judge. So he's ruling, he's leading the nation after Eli dies. And Samuel will be the last judge. How do we know that? Because he anoints King Saul, so now there's no longer a judgeship, it's a monarchy. So kings will now rule in Israel from the time of Saul onward. So he made a really big deal of Passover. What's important about that in relation to Jesus Christ? It was a looking back to Egypt being brought out, which was the picture of Jesus looking forward. The Passover is always looking forward to the cross. As John said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And of course, Jesus was crucified during what feast of Israel? The feast of Passover, fulfilling that feast, the feast of unleavened bread, and the feast of first fruits upon his resurrection. And then 50 days later, the feast of weeks, Shavuot, or Pentecost. So those 4 feasts were fulfilled in Jesus Christ from his death, his resurrection, and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, the harvest that began to be brought in. So that's one thing we know about Samuel now, is that he observed Passover in anticipation of the one who would fulfill it, Jesus. Secondly, we find out about him in Psalm chapter 99. Psalm 99 and verse 6. We can find out that he did this by reading Samuel's account, just seeing that he did it. But Psalm 99 tells us what it is that he did specifically. So we're at Carolyn, please.
Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called on the Lord, and he answered them.
All right. So we're told that Samuel was a prayer. A prayer. He's one who prayed. He called upon the name of the Lord, because he knew that God was a God who answers prayer. We're going to look at that in a minute or so when we see one of the aspects of how this parallel between Samuel and Jesus. But before we do that, I want us to look just at the context of Psalm 99. Let's just read through it here. The Lord reigns. Let the people tremble. He dwells between the cherubim. What is that referring to? The Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat. Let the earth be moved. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is high above all the people. Let them praise your great and awesome name. He is holy. The king's strength also loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. And then the verse that we read about Moses and Aaron, and as well as Samuel, those that are pointed out specifically as those who called upon the Lord, and the Lord answered them. The Lord spoke to them in the cloudy pillar. They kept his testimonies and the ordinance he gave them. You answered them, O Lord our God, and you were to them God who forgives, though you took vengeance on their deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for the Lord our God is holy. And that's really a picture of Samuel about drawing the people to God and his holiness. Samuel stands in contrast to Eli's sons, who are wicked and evil. Can I bring your attention to one thing on this map? As we looked at Ramah, we see that this on a map, satellite map today is Ramah. And we zoom in a little bit more, and that's it there. And notice today you can go to what is known as Samuel the prophet's grave. Anyway, that's just so you know that it is a current, a today recognized place. So let's come back to 1 Samuel. We see that he's a prophet, knowing also that Jesus himself is a prophet. And throughout Jesus' ministry, there'd be various times that people would say, could this be the son of David? Could this be Jeremiah or one of the prophets? But there are also times, and specifically in John chapter 7 and verse 40, where the people said, could this be the prophet? The prophet. John 7, verse 40. Could this be the prophet? What is the prophet? The Messiah. And what was it in relation to that they would say the prophet, not just a prophet? We find it back in Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15. And for the sake of time, we won't read it, but if you're taking notes, you can put that down. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, where Moses, at the end of his life, the people are just about to come into the promised land, and he says to them that the Lord will raise up a prophet after me, one who is like me from your brothers. Listen to him. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. And so he's not just talking about prophets that will be raised up throughout Israel's history, although that will be part of it. But ultimately, he's speaking about one person whom the Lord will raise up, and again, he is the Lord's anointed. Well, when we look at some of these parallels between Samuel and Jesus, let's look at this. First of all, is their miraculous birth. Miraculous birth. Okay? So Hannah was barren, and it was by the Lord opening her womb that she became pregnant. She conceived one, not just any old child, and I don't say that with any type of disrespect or irreverence at all, but a specific child that the Lord had already selected for her to conceive. It's interesting to me, thinking back to when Caitlin and Caleb were going through their journey of infertility, and she wanted a baby desperately. And she related, was it in a post she wrote, or she spoke it to us? Some way, Deb will be able to tell me in just a minute, where she said the Lord made her aware of the fact that this isn't just a baby so that she has some little person to fulfill her or to complete a hole in their family as though it might be a doll or something like that. But rather, this is the child I'm going to give you is a person with a destiny, with a future, with design and purpose. And her perspective completely changed, that this isn't just like a toy, not just a plaything. Is that something she wrote, or? So it was a timing thing, not just so that just any time is going to do, but this is a specific child for a specific time for people that this child, Cade, is going to interact with. We know it's Cade because he's now here. At that time, he was not yet conceived. And when I speak of as a toy, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way or that Caitlin was making it trivial. And toy wasn't the specific word. I was just trying to find the expression for it. All right, so the miraculous birth, of course, we're familiar with. We've already dealt with Hannah praying, and God answers in chapter 1, verse 19 and 20. And, of course, with Mary, when there's a miraculous birth, although this does not involve a man, this is by the Holy Spirit exclusively. Secondly, is in chapter 2, 1 Samuel chapter 2, and look at verse 26. And it's almost like a description of Jesus that is found in Luke chapter 2, almost like it's verbatim. All right, so we're at Johnny, I think, are we? 1 Samuel 2 and verse 26. So this was written on all of the what? This was written on all of the what? Oh, the caps at Circle Square Ranch. Okay. Luke chapter 2 was about Jesus. Okay. All right. So, okay. So Johnny, 1 Samuel 2:26. All right. And it's almost a verbatim. Verbatim means word for word reference or detail about Jesus in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52. And of course, that's in reference to the time when he's 12 years of age, Jesus, and during the feast, his parents were returning home, and on the way they realized he was not in the caravan, and they returned to Jerusalem and found him in the temple, talking with the teachers of the law. And then after they return, then it says that, and he grew in wisdom and stature in favor with both God and men. Oh, is that right? Every child memorized that at the ranch. Another aspect is not specific with these children, Jesus and Samuel specifically, but their mothers. Hannah, in response to her birth, the birth of her son, expresses something similar to what Mary does at the birth of her son. And both of them are like songs of thanksgiving. And there's elements in both of those songs, and 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, where Luke chapter 1, verses 46 to 55 is Mary's. And it's looking at how the Lord humbles the proud, and he exalts the humble, among many other things. We'll look at one more aspect tonight, and then we'll finish with Samuel next week. The last aspect I want to look at, which is one I've already hinted at from Psalm 99, is that Samuel was one who prayed. He was a prayer. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 12. So let's look at 1 Samuel 12, verses 22 to 23. And we're at Deb.
For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right.
So what does he say? Far be it from me that I should fail to pray for you. Far be it from me that I would sin against the Lord and refuse or stop praying for you. He's saying, I will not stop praying for you. Doesn't that sound like Jesus? An intercession going on. And there's a number of passages that we could look at in reference to Jesus praying or interceding for us, because some aspects was not specifically praying as much as it was in his actions that were intercession. So, I'll just mention some of them. John 17 and verse 22. Really the entire prayer of John 17, where Jesus said, I pray for these, my disciples, my followers, but I pray not only for them, but also for all those who will believe because of their testimony. So Jesus is praying for them. Luke chapter 22, verses 32 to 34. Luke 22, 32 to 34. And this is where Jesus speaks to Peter and he says, Simon, I have prayed for you that you will not fall. Satan has desired to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. After you have been restored, strengthen your brothers. So Jesus prays for him. Romans chapter 8 and verse 34, where the Lord intercedes for us. Romans 8:34. Romans 8:34. Then we've got Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. The Lord, our high priest, ever lives to make intercession for us. Then we've got 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. There is one mediator, one go-between, one intercessor between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5. 32 to 34. Then we've got one in the Old Testament, which is Isaiah 53, which is all we like sheep have gone astray, and also that Jesus was led as a sheep before her shearers, being silent. He was bruised for our transgressions and so on. But in verse 12 it says, so Isaiah 53 verse 12 says that he made intercession for us. And then we see in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1 that we have an advocate with the Father, one who intercedes on our behalf, one who speaks on our behalf, in our defense before the Father. Jesus Christ, the righteous. So we'll leave it there tonight because there's more to be looked at with Samuel. But seeing how Samuel lived a life that was a life by faith, even when there wasn't an experience that he really knew about of hearing from God. But even in that, as soon as he's made aware that this is the Lord, he's eager and willing to say, speak, because your servant shmas. Your servant is listening. So it's really after his name, right? The Lord, his name means that God heard, and he says, I'm going to live my life as one who wants to hear God. And so that's how he lives his life, and we'll see that more as we unfold this next week in dealing with Samuel. As we take from that, seeing yet again the work of God in an individual's life, even prior to their birth, in details that speak about his intricacy and intimacy of involvement. That it's not just circumstances and, well, let's try to figure this out. God is intimately involved in each person's life. And if we have an ear to hear and an eye to see, an eye of faith, then we will walk in step with what he's doing and how he wants to do it.
It's interesting to see even his process of healing when he was, because he took it very personal when Israel wanted a king.
Yeah.
And you can see the steps of his healing as he initially took to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And then he said, far be it from me to sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you.
Yes.
And so all of those things, you learn a lot from even from
So he still lived by faith, right? So that he would say, you know what, this hurt, but I'm still trusting God. My eyes are still on him. And so those that may not have heard, it was just in reference to the hurt that Samuel experienced when the people rejected God, but it felt to Samuel like they rejected his leadership. God said, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And Samuel said, I will not sin against the Lord by stopping to pray for you. I will continue to pray for you. So he's still working through following the Lord and being faithful to him in the midst of things that are hurtful or confusing, perhaps, but still a walk of faith. Now, Lord, I pray that you direct our steps. Help us so that we would be putting our eyes on you. The struggles, things that bring confusion or difficulties, that we would still trust in you, Lord, every step. That we would find encouragement and direction from your word. We bless you in Jesus' name. Amen.